Stanford University.
Thanks, Michelle. I promised Michelle that I would not philosophize about teaching, since my philosophy changes on a weekly basis. I would just come and do a kind of session of what I typically do as a historian of religions. However, when I started thinking about this, it dawned on me that I've been teaching graduate students and undergraduate students for 33 years. So I should have some dim notions of what this is about. And I'm willing to confess that that's half of my life. It also suggests that I'm going to live till I'm 99. This is really good. So there's some givens. There's some givens as I see the role of a pedagogue, and I've broken this down into 3 R's. First one is responsiveness to the learner at every stage of that learner's progress. Dialogical learning is preferable, even at the discipline's foundational level. I think it involves being alert about where we are starting, what kinds of interests are already there when you walk into the first session of a class or the first conversation with a student. As the learning progresses, my principle is that 2 heads are better than 1, 9 or 10 are better than 9, and I think that can go all the way up to about 150. Then it gets a little tense. The same applies to me that I think applies to students in classes of whatever size. It is a matter of taking seriously the curiosities of the people I'm in the room with. Being willing to be corrected, being willing to be stretched in viewpoint, being pressed to think harder by those I'm working with. Since we are, as teachers, spending considerable chunks of life together with students, there ought to be an expectation that we will come to know each other not only as idea producers, but also as vital beings, and in most cases, enjoy that communal process. So that's the first thing, responsiveness. Secondly, responsibility to the whole thing, and I'm now going to say something about the whole thing. What do we mean by teaching? There are large lecture settings, there are seminars, there are informal conversations. What are you thinking about studying? There are moments of advising majors. There are those moments in which you give directions on papers. There is the business of getting your papers graded soon enough and thoroughly enough to help the student before the next assignment is due. There is advising on choosing a major. There is advising on getting oriented to graduate work. There is giving counsel and feedback to TAs. There is dissertation planning and consultation with the doctoral student. And there is this part that no one ever talks about. There is the business of getting recommendations ready in time for fellowships and for jobs. There is also the business of indicating to students that that too is part of being a reliable, responsible teacher. I'm confronted with a reality. Many teacher-student working relationships cover 2, 4, 8, or if you teach for a long time, 20 to 30 years of a working relationship with a student. It's a long deal. Also, I think it's responsible and responsive to ask from time to time about a student's extracurricular life, suggesting that you know the student has or hopes to have such a life, and that you think that too is important. My third R is right stuff. I think this is the key to effective pedagogy. Choosing to work in a field or a discipline that is so intrinsically compelling that your job is as much getting out of the way of an encounter between its riches and the interested persons as it is one of sparking the interest. But, of course, one's own fascinations as a teacher, conveyed with some kind of enthusiasm, is an invitation to at least try the dance. There's an addendum. I'll put it in shorthand. Over a teaching career, your teaching changes, as do the focal points of your interest. Sometimes even your larger perspective on the data in your field. And this results in the fact that you are yourself perpetually a student, reimagining fairly regularly the ways your chosen stuff is right. If the love of your subject falters or fades, you have two options. You can recalibrate in order to keep the love alive, or you need to step away, at least step away as a teacher. But I want to return to point one, the dialogue with others, the responsive relationship. The dialogue with others interested in your discipline works against the fading of your love and your fascination for your discipline. Now, like a lot of other people in other disciplines, I chose the right one. And to me, it's a wonder that everyone in the university is not working precisely in my area of interest. And I'll now try to show you how obvious that truth is. I brought some texts from a church council in the year 692. The Council of Trullo, which means that this council was held in a domed chamber in the imperial capital at Constantinople. I don't know a whole lot about the history and historical circumstances surrounding this, so I wanted to bring some text from 7th century Constantinople that are mysterious to me, as they certainly will be to you, because I doubt you have seen them. And I would like to just show you what I think is the way to kind of get someone attracted to and then curious about historical text and phenomena. So with the help of Jeremy, I'll show you some slides. I have a plan here. I'm going to walk through 2 or 3 texts pretty quickly because I have 2 I want to have a conversation with you about, but feel free to interrupt me at any point and say, what in the world could that possibly mean? Now, I just want a brief orientation. By 692, we're in the Justinian and then Heraclian dynasty period. Some efforts have been made from the period of Justinian after the barbarian incursions into Europe to try to hold what was left of the imperial system and its Christian form, to try and restore and recover and stabilize that. Now we're in a situation, just to orient you, 692 CE is exactly the year in which Abd al-Malik began the construction of the Dome of the Rock. So Islam is up and running. In only 30 or 40 years, Carthage is occupied by Muslim armies. So that's what's going on around the southern fringes of the Mediterranean and also in the waters, because the Muslims have a navy. So this is a church council. Most of the people, it's an ecumenical council. 165 bishops come to Constantinople. Most of them seem to have come from the eastern part of the empire, to the east of Constantinople, although they're representatives from the church in Rome. And you will see that at least the passages that I've pulled out of this give some clues about what's of interest to the bishops as they convene to talk about their situation as representatives of the Christian community. And some of these may strike you as intriguing, not the thing you'll find bishops talking about today. There are those who are called hermits. That is, those who are dressed in black and wear their hair long. They have been those who are called hermits. That is, those who have dressed in black and wear their hair long have been found roaming throughout the cities and coming into contact with laymen and women, thereby insulting their own profession. Got it? They're not supposed to be having contact. They're hermits. We have therefore determined, we the bishops, that if they cut their hair and receive the habit of other monks, they may join a monastery and be enlisted there among the brotherhood. But if they do not want to do this, they are to be removed altogether from the cities and resettled in the desert, the place from which they derived their name. Greek eremos means desert, and hermits are people who come from the desert. I'd like someone to take a shot at why this canon or decree or fatwa, Christian fatwa, is being advanced. What's of concern that produces this kind of decree?
They are concerned about their own reputation.
Their own being the bishops and the churches,
Yes.
which suggests that they may have some concern about what these hermits are doing.
Yes, because they might be confusing the bishops with the hermits.
Why would these hermits, who are Christian ascetics, why would they be making these overtures towards men and women in the cities? To do what? Michelle, what do you think? Asking for money? They may be pressing them to convert. They may be going to Christians and saying you're not living an austere or rigorous enough form of Christianity. They may be charismatic figures who typically in the history of religion get themselves in strangely intimate relationships with the people they meet. So what's the goal or object of this decree? Yes?
The deacons thought all these hermits went to talk to people, spread the gospel, and talk about good news about God. And the people who decree this law think that's their privilege.
Right.
So they're insulting, the hermits insulting their profession.
These are freelance Christian ascetics rather than regularized and properly, can I say, ordered and controlled monks. Can you imagine a situation in which you're the bishop sitting at the council and you say, we really need this? Can you imagine a situation in which you know of some, let's say, abuses of religious charisma? Or do you see this strictly as the church fathers trying to protect their own authority? Okay, so if you love that canon, you could start trying to find out what is really behind that socially, politically, historically. I'm going to move on. Next one, because I have two we're really going to talk about. Higher clergy, simple clerics, and ascetics are not allowed to bathe in the public baths in the company of women. Nor is this allowed for any Christian man, since this practice is condemned even among the pagans. If someone is discovered doing such a thing, if he is a cleric, let him be deposed, either for a period of time or permanently, we don't know, or let him be if he's a layman, let him be excommunicated, that is, prevented from receiving the Eucharist for a period or permanently. What strikes you about that decree? What do all laws tell you? What do all laws that prohibit these, what do they tell you? Right. What's going on? So you can just reverse this. Higher clergy, simple clerics, and ascetics are bathing in public baths in the company of women. Okay? Notice something really interesting in this particular text. It is the end of the 7th century. Over 380 years since Constantine, and the pagans, the polytheists, are still in the picture. Okay, that's the first thing to notice. Is this about propriety? And if it's about propriety, what's the particular interest in trying to get this to be a practice rather than what is actually being practiced? What do the bishops want higher clergy, simple clerics, ascetics, or any Christian citizen to represent in terms of behavior in a society in which this is going on? Is this simply an Episcopal effort at social definition and behavioral definition of a group that the bishops hope will stand for an alternative and highly identifiable way of living? They're nervous. Okay. Simple ones. Next. I want to warn you, I have no idea. I'm really looking for some help here on this one. We have learned that in the land of the Armenians, the following practice is being observed. Certain men bearing pieces of meat offer them at the holy altars of the Christian churches, reserving the best pieces for the priests, as in the manner of the Jews. So that we may safeguard the purity of the church, we decree that it is not lawful for any priest to receive a specified piece of meat from those who are offering them, but they are to be content with those pieces that the one offering chooses to give him, as long as the offering is done outside the church. If anyone does not do things in this way, let him or her be excommunicated. Nothing you could suggest as an interpretation is necessarily wrong. Okay? Nothing you can suggest. So what's the phenomenon being described? Typically, yes?
Political favors?
Real loud.
Political favors? Or
Oh, political favors.
yeah, like,
Why not just hand the person some money? But now, let me add something and then go back to this. Typically in the early churches, the people who went to church for the Eucharist would bring bread and wine, which would then be offered at the altar. It would be consecrated at the altar and then distributed among the people. So it's not unusual for people to be bringing their offerings to make up the offering to the gathered community. And there's not a payola factor there unless you're really thinking about you're giving this to God as a manner of kind of, I'm giving this to you and I give it back to me. There's kind of payola mentality there. But here, what's curious is the fact that people are bringing not wine or bread, but meat. Yes?
The body of Christ, literally, right?
Say that again. Is this are you affirming this or what?
No. Well, that's why the meat can be on. They can have their meat, but just not on the altar.
Ah.
So
Bring the meat and even give pieces of meat to the clergy if you want to, but do it outside the context of the Eucharistic meal. Okay? Good. Back there.
Yes.
You first and then you.
It seems that there may be a concern for the church to become debased in a way that the Jewish temple was. In the line that said, "As
Yes.
the manner the Jews did." Jews were giving specific, or were trying to garner favor in the eyes of.
So here's a reference back to the temple cult.
The Jewish temple became corrupt because of that. Led to the destruction, possibly destruction of that commonwealth, and Christianity wants to try something different. Doesn't want to follow.
That's really interesting.
Pitfalls.
I was thinking, notice that it says, don't reserve the best pieces. A, meat's a problem. B, don't reserve the best pieces of the meat to give to the person who's making the sacrifice, as is the manner of the Jews. Now, it is not the manner of the Jews, and it has not been for how long? 620 years since the temple was destroyed. So it's a reference to the temple cult in Jerusalem. This gets to be kind of interesting historically. So, yes, your comment.
I was going to say the same thing he did, but just adding that their desire to safeguard the purity of the church. So they don't want any association with any other religion, and that
Our cult is completely different from that one. Okay? But we're still left with a really interesting kind of problem, aren't we? Meat offerings at the Christian church as part of the offering for the communal meal. So let's ask the question. Do you think there's any truth to this report that some Armenian Christians are taking meat offerings? Yeah.
I know that 200 years later, the Greeks accused the followers of the Roman Church of sacrificing a Paschal lamb on the altar with the host at Passover. As far as I know, that was not true.
Yeah, but the charge.
So I think it does open up the question of whether this is actually going on or not.
Let's assume that this is an accurate description of what some Armenian Christians are doing. And the report has gotten to this group of 165 bishops. And they have one reaction: this sounds like Judaizing Christianity to me, and we don't like that. And, yes?
It's interesting that they would have this memory over 620 years. Is it possible that this kind of practice is going on in private familial services?
Do you think it's possible that there are some Armenian Christians who have come up with some interesting innovations in their Christian worship that tries to embrace the whole tradition? That is, they turn to the Hebrew Bible, or what they're calling the Old Testament, saying, let's have a more elaborate form of offering to God than simply bread and wine. I mean, I don't know. What I'm faced with is a phenomenon which the bishops feel that it is necessary to address. It's a fascinating, strange little text. Well, Jack.
Brother, the second part explains that the priest should not be greedy, should not get the best piece of it. So it should get whatever the offer.
Well, I don't know how to read that last part.
This is a pagan custom which still exists in Armenia. They bring still a chicken under the church and cut the head of the offering for Thanksgiving or so. I saw it in Armenia. So
I've never known a clergy person who worked in the country who did not get offerings of food. Usually at the house rather than at the altar at the church. But, rabbits slain or whatever. I read this a little differently, Wojciech, I think. It sounds to me like it's okay for the priest to receive. He should be content with those pieces that the one offering chooses to give him, could be the best pieces. That's okay, as long as the offering is done outside the church. In other words, special gift for the celebrant of the Eucharist, okay, but let's not tie it up with the liturgy proper. Yeah?
There are other canons, like the Council of Trullo, that deal with this anxiety over Judaism.
Oh, yeah.
About not sharing unleavened bread.
See, here, this man knows more about the Council of Trullo than I do. This is excellent.
I know a couple of the canons.
Well, there's this very interesting one about do not eat unleavened bread as the Jews do. Do not live among the Jews. Do not give them medical attention and do not receive it from them. Okay, now ask yourself your question. What is obviously going on? All of those things that are being prohibited. So why do the bishops say, let's stop that? Because they want clear lines of demarcation drawn between these two communities and the faiths that they represent. Yes?
Do we know whether there were any Armenian bishops at this council?
That's the fun question. There were Armenian bishops at this council, yeah. And I want to know what they said. Maybe they said, I need your help with this, irregularity that is taking place in some of my churches. And if I can bring the word back from a council of all the bishops of the world, this is going to increase my authority. There were bishops. Yes?
I find it actually interesting, the very last sentence, talking about let him or her be excommunicated.
Yes.
I'm surprised that a her would have that kind of power, to be able to bring a sacrifice.
Well, men and women both brought sacrifices to the Eucharistic meals. For me, the question raised was, one of the questions I entertained was, what if these people couldn't bring bread or wine, but they did have stock? They had animals. And then the question is, so we have some women who are managing herds, etc. I mean, I don't know quite how to piece that together. Once again, yeah, Jeremy.
That puts a little of the responsibility of the infraction on the priest as well, that you've got to be content with any piece. So even if you get the chicken thigh, so maybe the priest is demanding the best piece. The priest is maybe the
remember,
problem
don't bring me the net. That's in the announcements after the Mass. Yeah.
followers, right? It's the priests that are maybe
Good.
the problem.
So let me just say parenthetically, that one of the great things about working in the stuff that I work in is that you run up against things that just defy your own cultural experiences, and you need to devise quickly some questions that allow you to try to begin to assess these. And you know that you may be asking the wrong first questions. And then you have the historian's wonderful challenge, dilemma, and fascination. Can I get more information about what was going on in Armenian churches in the late 7th century that would clarify for me what this decree from the bishops really addresses? Tough. And where do you look? Just text? Sonny?
That they bring these pieces of meat undressed and just put them on the altar, so they might not want to clean
They
up.
may just be being terrifically pious. I'm bringing one of the most valuable things that I possess. I'm bringing it here, and I didn't know the rules of the game. I'm just bringing my best offering.
Yeah.
Was what?
Health issues.
Health.
Yeah.
Health issues?
Spoiling meat on an altar.
Okay, so what are the health issues? I need help here. What are the health issues?
What are your point?
Sonny, were you talking about health? Health
No
concerns?
saran wrap.
Oh, so this is a tidiness issue. Okay. Yes.
I don't have a lot of details clear in my mind, but I remember that in the Old Testament, meat was a big issue, and I think that there was something about offering meat. In fact, last week I was listening to a radio program by, I don't know if you've ever heard of Chuck Swindoll, Insight for Living, and he was talking about Eli's family, who was from he was a priest and he had sons who had gone into the priesthood, but they were crooked priests. And they were supposed to be dealing with boiled meat and somehow, but these guys they wouldn't boil the meat. I think they took raw meat, and when you had boiled meat and you took the meat, you'd get smaller pieces because the meat was in smaller pieces. But these guys figured out a way to get more meat for themselves. So there was some kind of corruption going on. So perhaps this canon is referring back to the corruption of Eli's sons, and they're trying to preserve the purity of the church, but they don't want corruption going on.
Okay.
That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Okay, now I'm going to call your interpretation venturesome. I mean, you're moving. You're moving. I understand.
Historical stuff.
I understand.
Another thing, to answer your question, where would you go if you're saying if you're from one culture and you need to go find out? I would ask a rabbi, perhaps, or an Orthodox rabbi, Orthodox Jewish rabbi, to get some understanding about.
You mean the bishops would? Or you would, as a person at the...
Yes.
Let me just ask you something, though. Let me ask, because of these issues, I want you to go back. Let me read the first two sentences again. And I want you to be pretty hard-nosed about what you think is being said and what may not be being said. Sentences 2 and 3. Certain men bearing pieces of meat offer them at the holy altars, reserving the best pieces for the priests, as in the manner of the Jews. So, what's the phenomenon? Meat and the best pieces being presented to the priests. Right? So far, so good?
I was struck by actually the first two words, certain men.
Certain men.
So
and then we find out later, also women. Right.
That the Armenian priests who were at the council were not receiving the best pieces of meat. But the royal
Okay, now, here's where things get interesting along the lines you're suggesting about kinds of meat and preparation. Look at the next sentence. So that we may safeguard the purity of the church. What is the possible set of connotations attaching to the word purity. Yeah, what do you think?
There could be an idea of uniformity.
Could be the idea of, let's have uniform practice at this ritual in all the churches. Why should we have some churches where we're having meat, bread, and wine?
Canons are aimed at the priest. They're going to read them, aren't they?
What's another issue? What does the New Testament suggest ought to be the elements at this meal in which you commemorate the passion of Christ? Bread and wine.
In the manner of the Jews and purity of the church, those two things
I think
go together.
that seems to be a really crucial item.
Okay, you said be hardcore, hard-nosed, so let me go to is this a racist, is there racism in here? Is there anti-Semitism implied in here? Is that what you want us to observe?
Short answer. Anti-Judaism is fairly central to early Christian attempts to identify itself as a group no longer Jewish. It's kind of bedrock. But here, by the time you get to the late 7th century, and you look at some of the other decrees that come out of it, there seems to be a kind of overriding concern of the bishops to keep Christianity as identifiably Christian as you can keep it. In other words, do things when you get together that make it clear that you're doing things that belong to the strongest central traditions of the church, whichever one would recognize. Yes?
That they don't outlaw the practice altogether.
I know.
Maybe they don't feel they have the power to do it.
So for me, what's so intriguing about this is, what are the working assumptions of those certain men who are clearly Christians when they do this? Do they have perhaps a more comprehensive idea of what ought to be offered to God at the altar, and they're working it out in the Christian context to the horror of some other Christians who say, hey, we don't do meat here.
Men who are now Christians could have maybe a Jewish heritage, because I read a book a long time ago that the first people who professed to be Christians were actually Jews, and they practiced their Christianity with the Jewish culture was in there, but then Gentiles came in and started slowly kind of edging out those Jewish practices,
right,
so that it had no more of the Jewish cultural flavor, whatever you want to call it.
And you might think that the job was done of clarifying what Christians do that's completely different from what Christians do that's completely different and divorced from, different from Jews. But here we are in the late 7th century.
I don't know why that was a shift, but it seems to me that there was a decision that the Jewish practices could not be blended, or there could be no room for them, so they were completely edged out. I don't know why, except
I can talk to you about this, but I think you've just got a dissertation topic. Are you looking for a dissertation topic? I think. Okay, I'm gonna go. That's a yes.
The last sentence is still very
Okay.
intriguing to me. If it just
Exegete.
If it just said him, and you read it just as him, who would you think was being excommunicated? I actually think you would assume that it was the priests. So to me, that's saying that him or her may be priests.
There's only one argument against that. In every case in these canons where they talk about priestly behavior, they say, let him be deposed. And in every case where they talk about lay people, they say, excommunicate. So I think you're right in the first instance, that it's men and women making these offerings. Okay, I'm going to the last one, which was going to be our main piece of business today. Okay. This is, I don't know what category, well, I won't talk about it. I'll just read it. In some holy icons, one finds depicted a lamb to which the forerunner, that is the forerunner of Jesus, John the Baptist, points his finger. So in some holy pictures you see a lamb and John the Baptist pointing to him. The lamb has been received as a typos, a type of divine grace, prefiguring the true Lamb, Christ our God, who has been revealed to us through the law. Although in the church we recognize these ancient types and shadows as symbols and representations of the truth, we prefer the grace and the truth that we received as the fulfillment of the law rather than the prefiguring. The fulfillment rather than the prefiguring. In order for that which is perfect or complete to be seen by the eyes of all, we decree that he who is the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world, Christ our God, is, from this time forward, to be depicted in icons according to his human form instead of the ancient Lamb. Through him we have come to know the great humility of God the Word, and by this we may be led to the memory of his life in the flesh, his passion, his salvific death, and the redemption that came to the entire world. So here's a decree about art. And what's interesting about this decree is that you've got what looks like a theological, philosophical argument about why we need to stop working with the types and start dealing with the what? Pictures of the human Jesus that play out the details of his life, works, etc. Yes?
You cannot portray.
Say this loud, please.
Yes. It seems to me it's a reaction against Islam, which prohibits portraying human beings.
In the early period. And Islam is on the scene. And iconic. No pictures. Beautiful calligraphy. Takes 3 or 4 centuries to get into pictures. Okay? So, Islam may be in the background here as a factor, and the reaction of the bishops is more pictures. And make them a fuller exposition of what? The fulfillment of the law, which is an interesting phrase, rather than the prototypes that point towards Jesus. Now, let me, yes?
Variety of the icons, because there is a controversy over icons.
Speak up, please.
I mean, there's a controversy at this time over worship of icons, and it's easier to argue that if the icon is the human Christ, worshipping him is not as controversial as worshipping the picture of a lamb, for example.
Within 30 years of this, we're going to get the iconoclastic controversy in which a movement within Christianity says, no more pictures. It's causing people to honor and revere pictures in a way that smacks of idolatry. And that does seem to be influenced by a counter example in the Islamic world. But this, we're trying to look at large historical pressures from outside. What about the argument itself in the decree? What's the value to the bishops of saying no more symbolic figures like lambs, even if you've got John the Baptist pointing to it so you know that's Jesus? No more of that. What we want is art that depicts his human form instead of the ancient lamb, and then by this, through him, that is, through his life as spelled out in pictures, we have come to know the great humility of God the Word. By this we may be led to the memory of his life in the flesh, his passion, his salvific death, and the redemption that came to the entire world. So this is the theology that the bishops want out there. Right? No doubt. And they're afraid that so what's their anxiety about the images? Why not have both and? What about the types? What do you think?
Concentrating on the types and spending a lot of time going back into the Jewish Bible and finding the types of Christ prefigured, once again sort of mix the Christian and the Jewish tradition?
That's so interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So you can do a lot of dancing back there in the Hebrew Scriptures while you're trying to find Christian hints in the First Covenant, what the Christians call the First Covenant. But you're dancing too much in that book. Let's get to, notice, the fulfillment of the law. So what does the word law, do you think, connote here? I mean, you just been through a political campaign in which you learned that all lawyers are the source of all of our problems, okay? So you got to shake that. Yeah. Or, if we're talking about the difference between the prefigurings of the Savior and the actual representation of the Savior, law simply may be a synonym for the revelation. The revelation hinted at and the revelation completely revealed. So law could even be a code word for the whole revelation, which we've got in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But it's interesting that it is termed here the law by which we live, or the law by which we discern what we believe or what's happened. Yes?
I don't know a whole lot about this kind of thing, but what I see here, a number of things have come to my mind as a result of seeing all these different things. These people, I guess they're men, they seem to be very controlling, for one thing, and I also think they seem to be really kind of trying to funnel their beliefs in a very small passageway or tunnel, and they're kind of eliminating some of the symbolism from the past and just kind of really narrowing, they're really narrowing the conception of Christ. In Revelation, the Lamb comes back in the book of Revelation.
Right.
And so I think that, I don't know if this means anything, but I really am concerned that they're really trying to control people's experience of Christ.
Let me try a phrase on you, because are you saying that they seem to be pushing a move from the more symbolic to the more literal or pictured?
Yes.
Is that fair?
But it's not only that, they're narrowing the I think, for me, these different, you know, the Lamb and then Jesus in the flesh, and then there's other things that depict Christ. It shows just so many ways of experiencing Him, and they're now trying to limit that. And I think they're really tampering with something that God did. And I think this shows how when men kind of start getting in the middle of things, they mess things up. And then on top of that, if there is this kind of still trying to separate the Jewish from the getting the Jews out, that's racism's in there now. So you're really kind of messing something up that was okay to begin with, because it was from what God did, and it was included the Jews as He wanted it. Now they're trying to change all that to suit
What if they're simply worried about the fact that the symbolic is harder to control and can move in a lot of different directions, and we want to get to the point? That is the revelation to which all this was building. Your comment, please.
I mean, I was prefiguring what you just said. In fact, that a lot of this imagery, I think they're looking for it to be instructive, and allegorical depictions of the Lamb, whether or not John Baptist points to it or not, is a little bit tougher, I think, for people who are first coming to the faith to get a handle on. Well, this Lamb, okay, I thought the Bible says you're not supposed to have idols and, you know, the golden calf and all this. I mean, this could just simply be trying to streamline the communicative process for people coming to the faith. Just, you know, poor man's Bible. I mean, the pictures on the wall need to be clear about who you're worshiping and why.
Especially if you've been hearing sermons on your way to baptism and through your life in Christianity, and you know how many times the animal lamb comes up and how many different things the lamb can mean. And it's a kind of a grab bag. Yes, please.
I would agree with what's just been said. That and for this seminar today, it's very appropriate. These bishops want to be good teachers.
Bingo. That's it.
That's and you can't get the message across if you're showing pictures of lambs.
Yeah.
All
or nothing gambit. First of all, by the way, the lamb could easily be a girl. Okay, but so it's an all or nothing response. Quash all symbol. I'm still interested in your initial question of what's wrong with types, and so you're saying they're kind of having an.
You notice they don't say
all or nothing.
They don't say scratch out all the. They don't say scratch out all the other ones. They say from this point on, let's produce the kind of art that lays out the narrative.
I don't know if that lays out the narrative, and how do a lamb is also a reminder of the innocence.
Yeah, but there's another issue here that's really important. Each scene that the painters will produce of some moment in the life of Christ is itself laden with symbolism. So they're really asking for a more fully articulated set of symbols. Jeremy.
This one is, though, very much more conciliatory than the other. You know, the lamb's great, right? There's nothing wrong with the lamb. You know, it's not saying no lambs, right? I mean, a lot of it is kind of dancing around and saying, you know, well, this is good. We like this. There's good reasons for this, but you know, it sounds like, I don't know if they're on shakier ground or there's some resistance, or maybe there was some media, you know, that maybe, you know, it's kind of a 51% thing. Maybe there's not as much of a mandate for this one.
It's interesting. Yes. Good point.
What I found interesting goes a bit to what you said and you said. We kind of combines together the issue of the memory. I think what they're dealing with is the question, how do we create memory for people who come to us? Well, can you remember a lamb? Maybe not as well as a person. So there's a whole identification factor in it, I think. Which of course means at the same time you present a particular narrative that you want them to remember. And that means it's a selection and therefore also controlled and excludes certain other interpretations of that story. But that memory issue I found very interesting.
Let me just act like a late 7th century bishop for a second and tease out some of the implications of this. If you concentrate on episodes in the life of Christ, most of those scenes are either going to be teaching, birth, teaching, or scenes from the Passion story. We don't have a whole lot of other pictures to deal with. Through him, we have come to know the great humility of God. So this is sounding this theme of God caring enough about the world and individual beings in it to take on humility. And then we get these echoes of Philippians 2, emptying himself, taking on the form of a servant, etc. So that we may be led to the memory, first, of his life in the flesh, his passion, his death which saves, and the redemption, but also, what's the other part of this? That's the model for Christian living. Humility, giving of yourself, and they know when they're using this language that it's registering both as statements about the Redeemer of the Christian community, but also exemplar of the kind of behavior we're hoping for. It's a really interesting kind of thing. Now, I'm going to just show you two pieces of art. Thanks, Jeremy. I want to tell you, if you go to Ravenna, that image is a lot more beautiful than my slide. Colors are better. This is in San Vitale, so the wonderful Ravenna buildings, Christian buildings, are 5th and 6th century buildings. We don't have John the Baptist pointing, but we don't need to. Why? The halo. I mean, you're not going to say, oh, that's one of the lambs that Jesus particularly liked. Okay? You're going to see this and you say. Now, the next slide is what the bishops want. So he's being led to the crucifixion. His friend helping him carry the cross is there. This is from a different church. This is from San Apollinaire Nuovo in Ravenna. Different image. So I think this is a particularly interesting canon to reflect about in terms of how much it tells you about, 165 bishops agreeing that this is important enough to get on the books as something Christian communities should be, and their artists? Yeah, both of you.
You say agreed. I mean, you got to be careful. Just because it's written down as a canon doesn't mean there wasn't a huge amount of strife. I mean, as we know, it could have been you know, they could have been divided almost cleanly down the middle, but for some reason something pushed it over. So this really could be masking a much more fundamental conflict even within the bishop's community itself.
Yeah. There's an interesting... Justinian II, who is the emperor, and apparently, I know how difficult this is to say, he seems to have been a more pious and committed Christian than many of his predecessors as Christian emperors. And one of the interesting things about him is that he is the first emperor to issue coins that have the figure of Jesus on the coins. And he is presiding over this gathering of bishops because he wants them to come up with 102 canons giving a new direction or definition to the Christian community. So there may be some imperial leaning on this one, which then the bishops find the language to explain to him what he meant. Now, what am I doing? I'm speculating in the way you just necessarily have to do when you're presented with this kind of information. Okay. Any questions or comments? Yes.
I had another comment about mimesis. And
about mimesis?
Mimesis.
Yes.
So that the way that we want to see ourselves reflected and the limitations of the symbolic and the lack of cultural consensus, perhaps, that would make you feel insecure about something symbolizing a whole doctrine.
And especially if there is a fairly strong emphasis among the bishops as teachers and a thread running through Christian tradition that one of the things Jesus represents is the path. Most religious systems have presentations of the path, which you are to emulate or take up or whatever. I think you're right. I think that's an important point. Yes?
What other visual traditions were around at the time? Because I thought that comment was interesting, that the emperor didn't want himself on the coin anymore.
He put himself on the coins, but he produced at least one coin that had. Now, he is not the first bishop to have coins with Christian symbols on them, like crosses, etc.
But I was just wondering if they're trying to fill a space that's already there, but in a different, in the political realm, for instance, where else do you see people in pictures? In other words, at the time, in the artistic representations.
In Christian art?
At that time when they were discussing that. Or is there only Christian art? Is there nothing else?
Well, the Ravenna churches are a really good example. If you walk into one of these things, they have two large registers of art. One of which may, well, and within these two large registers, you get several things. One of them is the saints of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, narrative scenes in which you can recognize, or if you can't recognize them, they simply put the names in the mosaic. This is Elijah. This is Moses. Scenes of the life of Christ in another register, and then inevitably pictures of either the emperor who put up the money for the shrine, or the emperor and the bishop who is presiding over the construction of the shrine. So you get the patrons, the sponsors, scenes from the Hebrew Bible, scenes from the Christian Bible. And then mixed in all of these less specific, well, they're not less specific. All these symbols, like the lamb with a halo, are completely transparent. Now, later, when people start raising questions about undue pious attention to the images, one of the strategies is no more images, just give us the symbol of the cross. Just put the cross up there, nothing else. No humans. So you can see this question of how do you depict the faith, and I think, what do you intend to teach by the art that is there in the building, is something that's going to go through lots of interesting changes. Yes?
Is it possible also that the emperor was concerned about his own power? I guess we know the Constantine adopted Christianity to unite his empire.
I didn't hear that last part.
Constantine adopted Christianity to unite his empire,
right,
or used Christianity to. And you mentioned earlier that the pagans were still around and flourishing, and the pagans, of course, worshipped animals. So is it possible that Justinian was reminding people that Jesus was a person, and of course he's the ruler by the divine right of all emperors, and of course he's a person. So let's remember that,
yeah, that's possible,
that you should be worshiping the person, Jesus, and of course his divinely appointed ruler, me.
The big argument underneath all of this business about imagery and Christianity is that God cannot be pictured. So you have the development of religious art from the 3rd century on, Jewish and Christian, in which God does show up, his hand, out of the heavens. And in some 3rd and 4th century Christian art, God sitting there, sculpted in marble, the whole figure. So when people say, now wait, hold it, we're going overboard with depicting the God who cannot be comprehended in thought or word or image. So what do you think is the argument that the first Christian theologian is going to come up with who wants to have images in art? In this case, God stayed invisible while making his Son a human, breaking that line of division between what cannot be seen and what can be seen, and therefore, since the Incarnation, pictorial art of Jesus, who is divine, is legit. That's one of the main arguments. It's really interesting. I think I must stop. Thanks so much. Oh, yeah. We have a PS. We have a PS. Yeah.
Love the way you taught us today, because
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.